Your Excellency, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is our pleasure to welcome you to another Slovakia at 30 event dedicated to 30 years of Slovak domestic politics. It is the second of 4 series aimed at commemorating the 30th anniversary of establishment of Slovak Republic as an independent nation. We also welcome our special guest, Deegan-Krause, who is Professor of Political Science at Wayne State University, whose research focuses on political parties and democracy in Europe, with an emphasis on Europe's newer democracies and parties, including Slovakia. We are happy that Kevin did eventually make it to DC, as his flight from Detroit was postponed due to severe weather conditions. Thank you, Kevin. And the event is co-organized by our fraternal groups, Friends of Slovakia and Slovak American Society of Washington, and we thank them for all their efforts in this collaborative project. I would also like to introduce Georgene Chastain, the president of Slovak American Society of Washington, who will be moderating the event. Thank you, Georgene. Thank you. And now I'll pass the floor to Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the Slovak Embassy again. I'm sorry to be with my backside to you. It's Kevin Krause Deegan from Wayne State University, one of the best state universities in the United States. I passed around when I was in Detroit last year, and I think the campus is wonderful. The law school is wonderful, and I guess the political sciences faculty is even better. So I'm glad that we have this connection. And to my surprise, when I was sitting down, I've seen your chart, and it brought to me some interesting recollections of the Slovak past and maybe of the Slovak future. So I'm really looking forward to the debate. Thank you for the moderators, everybody here in the room and on virtual platforms. So without further ado, I think the best way is to floor to the moderator and Karen. Thank you.
So thank you all. I really appreciate it. Mr. Ambassador, thank you. Stanka, thank you very much. And thanks to the embassy staff as a whole. I know how hard you work and how often what you do isn't seen by others. And so I really appreciate it. And thanks to Friends of Slovakia and the Slovak American Society of Washington. Since the very beginning of my involvement with Slovakia, these organizations have been supportive and welcoming and inviting. And so again, I know how much work they do, completely unpaid, completely unrewarded, except for the kind of the good feelings that they get when they do the good work that they do, and help to really bring the United States and Slovakia together in important ways. So I should probably explain why I'm sitting in front of you today. I saw the previous presentation of 30 years of Slovak foreign policy, which was understandably presented by a Slovak. But why bring an American in front of you to talk about 30 years of Slovak domestic politics of all things? And so I should put it into a little bit of context. My experience with Slovakia actually is just over 30 years. It's, I think, coming up on 33 years. So I predate the topic and I predate the independence of Slovakia, although only by a little bit. I was part of that generation of young Americans who didn't know what they wanted to do in the 1990s and went to Czechoslovakia to teach English. Originally, I was in Plzeň in the Czech Republic, what was then Czechoslovakia. But my first travel, my first trip as a teacher was to Bratislava, was to Slovakia. So in, I think, Christmas of 1990, I visited the city for the first time. I'd like to say I fell in love immediately, that it was love at first sight, but it was just part of a broader trip to a lot of different places. But as I went back to graduate school after several years, the country was breaking in two. And my dissertation advisors and others said this might be an interesting chance to look at a country that's going in two different directions at the same time with a common social and demographic underpinning. And I realized then that I knew a lot of Czechs. I knew a tiny bit of Czech, not very much, but I didn't know many Slovaks and I didn't know a lot of Slovak. So I should start in Slovakia. And that was really a fateful decision for me. It's really one that shaped my life because I moved to Bratislava for a summer. I moved there again the following summer and then the following year for a year and a half, and was welcomed by Comenius University, was welcomed by Slovak civil society, and was welcomed even by Slovak political parties, all the way from the Hungarian parties to the Christian Democrats to the movement for a democratic Slovakia. And that really shaped my academic career. It gave me the raw materials for a doctoral dissertation, and it really set my career in a kind of firm ground, understanding one place, I think, as well as a foreigner like me can come and understand. And I still know how much I don't know every time I return to Slovakia. But it has been amazing to be welcomed into what has really become my second home. And so these days, I know that in some ways my time has come and gone. When I went there at the beginning, there was a reason for Western academics to come and study, because there was a gulf between Slovak academia and American and Western European academia. We could sort of bring things to one another. We could bring certain methods that weren't being used in Slovakia at the time, and vice versa. These days, Slovak and American and Western European academia is really deeply integrated, and some of the best scholars in the world are Slovak scholars, with Slovak training, with Western training, with American training. And so I sometimes ask myself, what am I still doing here when there is a crop of Slovak scholars who can run rings around me on virtually everything? But one of the things that comes with a little bit of age, maybe a little bit of a loss of ability, but a little bit of history and a little bit of perspective. And so these days, I feel like my role is really to stand back, to be able to look at Slovakia from a little bit of a distance. I don't get to travel there as much as I would like, and so by necessity, sometimes it's a little bit of a difference. But it's also a little bit of a historical difference. And so I'm able to do a couple of things these days. I'm able to actually look at the things that Slovakia has to teach us about the rest of the world. A lot of the things that happen in Slovakia actually end up setting trends for things that happen elsewhere, for good and for bad. And the things that happen in Slovakia sometimes, when with Slovaks who follow the news very closely and see things going on in politics, I think you can get caught up in the details. And partly my advantage is that I can actually take a look from a distance, from a higher altitude, and to try and find patterns in Slovakia's politics. So what I actually want to do is just start really quickly by trying to explain Slovakia in four shapes. My daughter has put me onto an internet comedian who has a YouTube program called My Favorite Shapes, which is kind of a funny concept. But I have four shapes that I want to show you to talk about Slovak politics. So you should see something on there that says four shapes, if I'm not mistaken. I want to start with the first shape, and I want to start with the big picture. Which is really the nature of the game in Slovakia, the nature of democracy in Slovakia. And so you'll see a wiggly line that sort of goes up and down, but for the most part goes up. In the biggest picture, I think when we look at Slovakia's democracy, the underpinnings of Slovakia's democracy, the kind of structural basis on which its political system rests, I think we see a lot of ups and downs, but I think we see a genuinely positive trend. Now, I know some people who follow Slovak politics will now look at me and think that I'm a little bit crazy to say that, we're on a generally positive trend. But the longer I've looked at it and the more I've been able to step back, the more I think that the fundamentals are really quite sound, that they are really quite stable, and that while there are ups and downs, for the most part, the trend line is up. And that, I think, is something that is sometimes hard for even Slovaks themselves to see. And I'm not really familiar with a lot of other countries. The Slovaks, to a certain extent, the Czechs, are really the only kind of nation, národ, that I've gotten to know. But I know of that there is a kind of inherent sense that things will go immediately wrong at some point, that things must be going to the devil at some point or other. And the grounds for optimism are often, even if they're there, they're not seen. And I guess my perspective as someone from the outside is a moderately optimistic overall perspective, that I see these democratic underpinnings, and I think we'll have a chance to talk about those. But I think the democratic underpinnings, the basics are quite sound. even if there are problems, even if there are difficulties. So the first shape is that kind of gently wavering upward shape in terms of democracy. The second shape, and actually, if you look at the surveys done by academics who look at the state of democracy, you can see a chart there that sort of looks like a sort of sharp drop. That was during the wars, and then a fairly sharp increase. That was 1989 and 1990. This is the whole region, and Slovakia is right in the middle of that tunnel, right in the middle of that dark line that says that things are generally, even though they're wavering, they tend to be going up. When we measure Slovakia's readiness for democracy, the practical politics, and how democratic the country can be considered by those academic indicators. The second shape is a little bit more unorthodox, and here I actually want to use a little bit of a kind of prop example, because this is something that we do when we think about political science, when we think about how countries are organized. The overall game in Slovakia, the democratic game, seems fairly sound. Within that, we have to ask questions about what people argue about, what they fight about. What are the stakes in the game? And one of the tools that we use is to look at dimensions or axes of competition. What do people really compete about? What are the various sides? And when we look at a normal country, we can see that there's often a kind of left-right divide between one side and the other. That left and right defines what people are really arguing about. And left and right can mean all sorts of different things depending on the culture, depending on the place, depending on the time. And in Slovakia, I would argue that for the last 30 years, probably the most important of those dimensions hasn't so much been a classical left and right, but really an identity kind of divide. The main area of competition has been one about what it means to be Slovak, and what the kind of foils are to Slovakness. And early on, it was the Czechs, Slovaks and their relationships to Czechs. After independence, it was Slovaks and their relationship to Hungarians in particular, but also Slovaks and their relationship to broader Europe. And that kind of national identity or identity divide, that identity axis has shifted over time. Its meanings have shifted to the point now where it really has a lot to do with foreign policy and relationships to Russia. It has to do with Slovakia's relationship to the West and Western values versus to the East and more sort of traditional cultural or conservative values. But that seems to be a theme that continues through the whole time. But I also know that when we do this, there are often multiple different axes. There are different things that people compete about that don't have anything to do with one another. So sometimes we'll be fighting on cultural axes, and sometimes we'll be fighting on others. Slovakia has from time to time had pretty intense competition around economic axes. So if the first decade and really parts of the third decade were dominated by these questions of the nation and the meaning of Slovak identity, that second decade, really from about 2000 to about 2010, was dominated by an economic axis. It was dominated by a sort of traditional left-right about really the size of the state, how the state should be organized, how big public benefits should be, how big taxation should be, what kind of taxation there should be. And then in Slovakia, especially in the last 10 to 12 years, I think we can talk about a third dimension. So, see if my toy works. But I think we can think about it really in this kind of third space. In my classes, I've become a kind of prop comic because I really like to do that. But I think we can think about something that looks a little bit like this, where we've got a third axis, which is really unrelated to the other two, which goes sort of back and forth, that really has to do with things like corruption, personality, things that are kind of amorphous and difficult to define, but have really dominated Slovakia's politics over the last 15 years. That don't look like a traditional national identity axis. They don't look like a traditional left and right economic axis. I won't try and use it, but I actually created a kind of weird and wobbly one to stick in there, rather than a standard dimension, because it really is a hard one, and it's one that sort of loops back on itself and so on. But I think this notion of Slovakia's politics being about different kinds of competition at different times, with different parties representing different positions in different places, I think it goes a long way to helping understand the kind of continuity in Slovakia's politics over time, from those national-related identities to the economic ones, and in some ways back to the national ones, but the national ones having changed form over time, and the addition of these personality-related questions and corruption-related questions as well. So for me, that is the basis for understanding, and I think it helps us understand why there are so many different political parties, because if you have a three-dimensional space, there's a lot of space for a lot of different political parties that stand for a lot of different things in that particular space. So just keep that kind of three-dimensional axis or graph in mind. The third shape that I want to show you is this one. And this is what happens when we try to look at Slovakia's actual political parties, and not just the sort of the nature of the game, the stakes of the game, but these are the players of the game. And so I've actually prepared for all of you a handout that you can take home. For those of you online, we'll make sure that there is a PDF that's available to you. But one of the things that I've spent quite a bit of my life doing, just for my own understanding, is trying to trace the ins and outs of Slovakia's political party competition over time. And so if you look on it, you'll see what looks like a railroad siding or a series of tracks, but these are Slovakia's political parties over time, with the size being roughly proportional to the amount of votes that they've got. And you can see how incredibly complicated it is. Parties come and go, they get big, they get small, they split, they merge, they shift positions on the political axis. It really is an extraordinarily complicated political system. Now, in one way, maybe the only way, this is good for me because it keeps me employed. It allows me to keep my job as the person who tries to decipher this kind of thing. But I can understand that for those who follow Slovak politics, there is an incredible amount of complexity here and, quite frankly, a pretty significant amount of instability here. And so if we're looking at Slovakia, I think the overall democracy trend is relatively positive and relatively smooth. You've got movement among those three axes. This is really where the motion happens. This is where the change and the variation and the confusion and the complexity happens. And that doesn't show any signs of abating. But I guess it's not all bad news, because the last thing that I want to say, the last shape that I want to give, is just a kind of gentle undulating line, because while all of those parties that you see there move, shift, change with incredible complexity, on the backside, on the bottom, what you'll see is actually what happens when you try and identify those parties according to their general ideological or political position. And so what we see is that while the parties change radically, where the parties change quite a bit, the overall size of the voting for Hungarian parties, or voting for parties that call themselves right, or parties that call themselves left, or parties that call themselves nationalist or have a strong kind of Slovak national bent, those have not changed nearly as fast. There's been some variation. Things move back and forth, just like they do in any democracy. But the underpinnings, the sort of socio-cultural underpinnings, the attitudinal underpinnings of Slovakia's development, the things that people want, the things that they value most highly, those have stayed moderately stable over time. It's just that the political parties that represent those positions have changed with alarming frequency over time and show signs of continuing to change. So on top of all of that change, there is a kind of underlying stability, which doesn't necessarily make Slovak politics any easier to track, but it does tell us that there is a kind of core. There are some core beliefs that produce these kinds of things, and it's rare, regardless of which party represents which idea, for nationalist parties to get a huge amount of the vote, or for Hungarian parties to get a huge amount of the vote, or for right-wing parties, frankly, to get a huge amount of the vote. With the left, you see parties coming and going, and a new kind of group of categories, and I will admit I've copped out here, because in the middle, in the gray, are parties that I have a difficult time categorizing according to those. Those have been growing lately, and that is something that we can talk a little bit more about, because I think it's really one of the important things we need to know about Slovakia's politics. So that's my general introduction. I know all of you have questions. I suspect there are people online who have questions, and I know that you have some questions as well.
I do. Thank you, Kevin. The last few years in Slovakia have seemed really chaotic. Is it really that bad?
Yes and no. And actually, I mean, I know there are people in the audience who've lived this, who know this in some ways better than I have followed it. I get to watch it from a distance. I get to review it from afar and dip into the news and dip into the daily newspapers and the TV news. But the chaos from the outside really does seem quite marked. During the COVID period, after the COVID period, the governments of Matovic and Heger, the really complicated coalition maneuvering, in the end the collapse of that coalition, the vote of no confidence, and then just within that coalition, the inability of political parties to restrain some of their own members, to kind of maintain a kind of coherent identity, really in some ways to restrain themselves. I think there has been it really looks from the outside exceptionally chaotic. And I will say, and I want to respect my hosts and those who've invited me here, but certain Slovak politicians in this current era are exceptionally chaotic in their own personal habits, in their own personal behavior, and really jump from one thing to another, almost with a kind of attention deficit or a desire to move from one thing to another, and really very few sort of external constraints, very little of the kind of political conservatism in the personal sense, very little of the kind of political restraint that we see in many other places and many other countries. And I think we've seen this in other countries as well. I think we've certainly seen it in the United States. What can happen when there are political leaders who feel themselves kind of unconstrained or unbound by normal rules of decorum, by normal rules of political timeframes and political institutions. And I think that's certainly what we've seen in Slovakia during this particular government. And the previous government itself had a difficult time maintaining a coalition majority, and there have been some really short-term governments in Slovakia. So I think we do see that kind of instability. We've also seen a ton of instability, as you can see from the graph, in Slovakia's political parties. They come and they go, they move, they shift, they split, they merge. At a certain level, though, underneath it, I do see a kind of stability. And in the first place, I would say that while this government, at least certain members of this government, and certain members of the parties in this government have shown a kind of erratic behavior and a kind of chaotic relationship to each other and to the voters, the appointees, not only the Foreign Service appointees, but the ministerial appointees, and many of those who are working in kind of government-related fields, has shown a stability, I think, that is belied by what's going on at that top level. So underneath the flutterings that are happening in government halls and in Parliament, I think there is a kind of stability that underpins that, and then certainly underneath it, as that graph shows, and I think as my recent experiences in Slovakia have shown, I think there is a kind of stability of overall attitude and overall mood that instability at the top doesn't really capture. So I'm guardedly optimistic that this is a kind of phenomena of what's going on at the top, while acknowledging that what goes on at the top actually shapes what goes on in the country as a whole. And so it's something that we need to pay attention to. Unfortunately, it doesn't look very much like that kind of instability is going to stop very, very soon, because the large numbers of parties, the difficulties of forming coalitions. It may be enough to sort of keep certain people who are particularly erratic from engaging in that kind of behavior in the halls of government, but I think we are in for a kind of rocky ride at the top level, even as the underlying sort of underpinnings remain moderately stable.
Okay, what about extremism? Seems to be a problem in Slovakia. How extreme does it get?
It can get pretty extreme, and I think most of people in this audience have noted it and they've seen it. Slovakia has not been a stranger to political extremism, and really from the very beginnings of the time that I started to go there in the early 1990s, we saw people whose beliefs were one or two standard deviations from the norm. They were pretty far from the center, and not just extreme in terms of their distance from one another's, but extreme in terms of what they were demanding, what they were seeking. During the 1990s and even into the 2000s, we saw some really incredibly harsh rhetoric by certain Slovak politicians about the Hungarian minority, about Roma. We saw some pretty extreme views about democracy itself. We've seen a return of some of those, especially with certain political movements that have gotten into parliament in the 2010s. And so I really think on that kind of national or cultural issue, we've seen some really extreme views. Now, those extreme views have never really attracted the votes of more than about a tenth of the Slovak population, which isn't that different from most of the other countries in Europe, where radical right parties regularly win between 5 and 15, in some cases like Italy, even more higher percentages of the vote. So it's not unusual in the sense, but it does have a kind of strong extremist position on national questions. And often it is the Roma and it is immigrants who bear the brunt of that kind of extremism. The last couple years, I think we've also seen in Slovakia the rise of something that looks like an extreme left. There have always been sort of parties that have been on that extreme. There was a communist party, a workers' party in Slovakia, which had sort of strong opinions about the state, strong opinions about the return to something that looked like state socialism. I think in the last few years, though, it started to be a little bit more extreme, coming from parties that once were fairly mainstream. So I think the party Smer, that probably most of you are familiar with, has moved in its rhetoric on foreign policy questions, on orientation questions, to a position that is further away from the Slovak center, that seems to be more oriented towards Slovakia's neighbors to the east, particularly Russia. And so depending on how you want to define that extremism, I do think we see a fairly significant amount of it in Slovakia's discourse. And that discourse also has become a place of extremism. And this is not something that's unique to Slovakia. We've seen it immediately in the Czech Republic, in almost every European country, and in this country as well. The rise of modes of discourse, whether through social media or certain other kinds of internet-based conversations. We've seen conspiracy theories, and we've seen some really pretty sort of radical views, both about ethnic minorities, about NATO, about Russia. We've seen those things emerge. I am hopeful and guardedly optimistic that those discourses don't dominate Slovakia's politics, that they are not the kind of sole voice. And while they can have an outsized impact, my hope is that there remains a kind of stable space within the remainder of Slovakia's political system. And it's really going to be a big question, I think, in the coming election, whether the parties that espouse those views are then incorporated into the overall political system. Again, I'm guardedly optimistic that parties that are on the extreme ends, either of the national or of the kind of left-right, the foreign policy axes, that those parties don't end up included in the next government. But it even makes a difference that those parties exist, because it limits the flexibility that others have in forming a government. So I won't say that it's a small problem, but I think the Slovakia's politicians and the rest of the political spectrum have the ability to keep it from becoming an overwhelming problem for Slovakia.
Some people say that Slovakia's democracy itself is at risk. What do you think?
When I was in Slovakia, and I had a chance to be there for almost a month last summer and speak to people from across the board, from political parties and civil society and journalism, the judicial system, I think there was a fear among some Slovaks, and I'll be curious to know what people think, because many of you have more direct contact than I have, particularly in the last year. And in many cases, that fear took the form of fear of what's been going on to Slovakia's north and south, fear of urbanization following the Hungarian model, or fear of something like a Polish model following the Kaczynski path. And I think it's right to be afraid of those kinds of developments. I mean, what we've seen in Hungary is pretty shocking. We've seen the emerging and ever tighter control of a political system by one particular political party. And whether you believe in what that party believes or not, I think it's hard to look at those conditions and to see them as positive, affirming for democracy itself, the control of media, the way that the party in charge deals with its opponents, I think is highly problematic and really locks itself into future governance. It sort of preserves its own monopoly on power. In Poland, the path has been a little bit less direct, a little bit less clear and solid, but I think you see some of those same tendencies. And even in the Czech Republic, you've seen over time some inclinations toward that kind of development. I think the good news is that Slovakia doesn't seem to be moving in that kind of direction. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't other things that can go wrong and other problems. But for the most part, Slovakia has maintained a lot of the things that have been lost in some other countries that have moved in a more authoritarian direction. It has maintained a pretty high degree of political pluralism. There's no one political party that in Slovakia dominates the political scene the way parties do in Hungary and in Poland and in parts further to the east. I think there's not even a kind of movement in that direction. If anything, Slovakia has moved away from that. In the mid-2010s, Slovakia had a party that could win a parliamentary majority all by itself. That's not the case, and no one's even close to a quarter of the vote in Slovakia at the moment. So I think that kind of party fragmentation, while it causes other problems, is really positive in preventing the kind of agglomeration of power that we fear. So I think if there's danger for Slovakia's democracy at the moment, it is not in the direction of a kind of one-party state, or at least one-party dominance of the state. It may be more in that direction of fragmentation and the ability to make coherent and consistent policy that a country needs really to move forward. And so having multiple different parties kind of preserves you from authoritarianism in a way, but it also creates other problems and other issues. So I think we would be looking in a different place for the dangers. But I also have to say that having looked at Slovakia's civil society, having looked at its media, having looked at a whole variety of those systems that preserve democracy, the things that keep democracy alive, those were shockingly robust. And I've been in Slovakia and seen it at various snapshots over time. I began my own graduate work looking at the underpinnings of Slovak civil society, and to see Slovak civil society last summer in its kind of robust strength. I know there are problems and I know there are limits, but to visit literally dozens of Slovak civil society organizations in almost every realm of life, to see organizations that are institutionalized, that lack for funding, but still know where that funding is available, aren't dependent exclusively on foreign donors, do their own fundraising, do their own development. I was really quite encouraged that the kinds of things that keep democracy alive seem themselves to be alive and well in Slovakia. And so fingers crossed, thumbs held, it will continue in that direction.
Sounds good. Slovakia has elections coming up in just 6 months. What does the future hold for Slovakia's politics?
I think the answer from the crowd sort of summarizes it, but I do want to do a little bit, and I kind of guessed the questions might be coming, so I just did a little bit of work on this, and so I actually wanted to sort of to share this with you. So all of you should have on your sheet on the top of one page. So this is a kind of infographic that my colleague Tim Houghton and I have made. I should say, by the way, that a huge part of my understanding has come not only from generous Slovak colleagues, but my co-author Tim and I both studied Slovakia at about the same time, separated by a couple of years, and have developed a really sort of lifelong friendship and a professional working relationship, working on questions related to Slovakia. And so the documents that you see here, the graphs and the charts, these are really a joint work, and I wouldn't want to leave credit short for him. But one of the things that we've done is to sort of look at Slovakia's political parties, where those parties have come from and where they've gone. And what's on your sheet is actually the report that we did shortly after the Slovak elections of 2020. But things have changed since then. And, that election itself was a significant change election in political science. We talk about volatility, the tendency of things to change. Slovakia has consistently volatile elections. It's not that unusual anymore. The world is moving in the direction of volatility, but Slovakia is certainly in this, if not in other things, a trendsetter. Because what you get when you look at this is you get a variety of a lot of political parties which have some stake. Some of them from 2020 seem to be sort of moribund at the moment. So the party Vlast and the party Good Choice, Dobra Volba, have both been polling at a really low level. They don't seem to be sort of contenders at the moment. There are also a couple of parties that tend to represent Hungarian voices in Slovakia. In 2020, that Hungarian voice was split between two different parties, and that split actually prevented either one of them from getting into parliament. Now, that doesn't mean that they made tactical decisions. They made choices based on what they felt, but if you combine the votes for those two parties, you have a party in parliament. If you split them up, you have a party that's outside of parliament, falls short of the 5% threshold that you need. Since then, there's been a lot of development, and there have been attempts to unify Slovakia's Hungarian parties, and there have been attempts at unification and also splits. And so now when we look at the polls again, the parties have merged and resplit in such a way that the numbers are almost exactly where they were before, 4 and 2, which, if those trends continue, would keep both parties out of parliament again. Now, there may be room for consolidation or voters to shift one to the other. And I think one of the interesting questions we'll see is there going to be a set of Hungarian representatives in Slovakia's parliament again after this next election? Right now, it's an open call, and it really depends on the ability of these parties to find a way to work together. They both have reasons why they don't want to work with the others, but as long as they do that, they really significantly reduce the chances of getting them in. There were a couple of older parties that didn't actually get into parliament in Slovakia's last election, the Slovak National Party and the Christian Democratic Party. Both of those parties have strengthened just a little bit from their record low performances in 2020. The Slovak National Party is polling around 4% right now. That doesn't seem to be enough to get it in on a regular basis, although occasional polls put it above 5%. And then the other party is the Christian Democrats. Now, they've actually strengthened quite a bit, and polls reliably put them above the threshold. So actually we can move the sort of threshold down there. And we can see, but at the moment, the Christian Democrats look set to come back. And I will say one of the really interesting things that we see in political parties across Central and Eastern Europe is that newcomer parties oftentimes will get in and fall short. When those newcomer parties fall short, they almost never come back. But when older parties fall short, those parties sometimes have enough institutional weight, they have enough membership, they have enough regional and local strength, mayors and members of local councils, that they can actually manage to rebuild after a collapse. They can change their leader, and they can somehow re-engage the voters and their supporters. And that seems to be what the Christian Democrats have done, at least enough to get over that 5% threshold. It's still an open question. Anytime a party's polling within 1% or 2% of that 5% threshold, it's an open question, because a lot can change. But at the moment, the Christian Democrats have done what they've needed to do to get sort of back over that limit, including strengthening party organization and new leadership. That's not true of all of the parties. And like I said, when parties tend to fall below, they tend to remain below, especially if they're newcomers. And so Zaludi for the People, the party of former President Kiska, has fallen short, actually fell short quite early in its political career. And it's now really polling around 3% and looks to be out of the political game. So we can sort of move it down below the threshold. Whereas the other parties that have been above the threshold have tended to stay above it, but not without their struggles and not without their problems. So interestingly, Richard Sulik's party, Freedom and Solidarity, got into parliament with 6.1% in the elections. It's currently polling at around 6%. It really hasn't changed at all. It had a period of some better support during the early time in the government, but it's really back almost exactly where it was. And so that party looks to get back in, but I have some sort of qualms about that. We'll see in just a minute. The party Progressive Slovakia and Spolu together that just barely, heartbreakingly didn't get into parliament, because even though they got over 5% running as a coalition, they needed 7%, and they fell short by 0.03%. That coalition has actually dissolved quite early into two sort of component parts. Of those two component parts, one of them, Spolu, didn't do as well as the other. It languished at around 1%. Spolu has since found a kind of new life with a figure that some of you may remember, Mikuláš Dzurinda, and now it's languishing at about 2%. So it doesn't seem to have really improved the party's performance, although there is a chance that having that name there would improve it. But if it doesn't seem to improve it right away, I wonder really how much it's going to do. On the other hand, Progressive Slovakia has strengthened dramatically. So it's actually now polling, I think, taking advantage of disillusionment among supporters of the other government parties. And this is one of the few advantages of not getting into parliament, is that you can act as a kind of reservoir for people who are really deeply disillusioned and the ones who did get into parliament. So Progressive Slovakia is at around 11%. The radical right, Kotleba's party, actually has had a split of its own. So we have Kotleba's party and we have the party Republika, led by Milan Urik. And in this case, what we see actually is that the split has benefited the newer of the parties. So for a variety of reasons related to Kotleba's legal problems and a kind of disillusionment with the party, Republika has actually taken over the bulk of the voters. So if you add them up, they're almost exactly the same as the total number of voters was before the election, from about 8% to about 9%. And that percentage has remained remarkably stable. Kotleba's party got 8% in the previous elections, 8% in the last elections. Now you add the two together and it looks like about 9%. So when we talk about certain changes and chaos and variability, there are certain things that tend to sort of say the same, and that sort of 9% for the radical right seems pretty stable in that space. Another kind of, for me, really interesting example of stability has come with Boris Kolar's party, We Are Family. Given Kolar's personal history, one of the most ironically named parties that I could possibly think of, but that party has actually remained almost exactly where it was in the previous election. Again, it had gone up and gone back down, but it stayed at around 8%. And then, really, in some ways, the big change, the big landscape change in Slovakia's election has been the split of Fico's party Smer, between Fico and his prime minister and, at one time, sort of right-hand Peter Pellegrini. So what we get, interestingly, with this party split, we go from 18% that Smer led at the time by Pellegrini, at least led on the electoral list by Pellegrini, led in formal terms by Fico. When you split those two, you actually then get two parties worth 90. It's like an amoeba sort of splitting in half, and both sides being the same size as they were before. And so we now have two parties on the left, one, Fico-Smer, moving sort of more to the radical left, while Pellegrini's Hlas stays closer to the center. And then that remarkable 25% result for Matovic's Ordinary People, when we look at polling now, has dropped to 7%. So the party's at about a quarter of what it was. Interestingly, that 7% is not that different from what Olano did in the election before the most recent one, and so on. And so there does seem to be, in all of this churn, a kind of underlying stability that then gets shaken up as elections near. So, I mean, if we reorganize this, I mean, you can see there are a lot of political parties right now. I mean, right now we've got 8 different political parties that are regularly polling above the 5% threshold, and some really complicated coalition math when we look at that. If we sort of group parties together according to right and left and radical right and sort of I don't know down in the bottom center and Hungarians, even if we sort of exclude the ones that don't have much of a chance of getting into parliament, we still get some remarkably complicated coalition math. Now, in the current situation, the party Hlas, Pellegrini's party Hlas, because it is relatively moderate on the left, seems to hold a really important position in this frame. Pellegrini may have the choice of who he wants to ally with. If he wants to ally with Fico and the radical right, Fico's showed a willingness to ally with the radical right. If Pellegrini wants to go along in that direction, at least it would provide him with a parliamentary majority. On the other hand, Pellegrini could ally with others on the other side, the center-right, or some of the newer parties like Olano and Kolar's parties that are really hard to define, that are very much on that personalized axis. And so it really is going to be up to them. I think Kolár also, because he will apparently sort of coalesce with anyone who would like, also has a really strong room for maneuver in this case. So both Pellegrini and Kolár really hold the key to Slovakia's next elections, at least if we do it the way it is now. And the one thing that I want to add to this is the way it is now is rarely the way it is when it actually happens. And so when we look at this, we have to actually add to our graph a different person. Now, this person is probably not familiar to many of you. This is a gentleman named Robert Golob. And I don't put him on here because he is a Slovak politician. In fact, he's not. He's a Slovenian politician. But the reason I put him on there is that Golob is a Slovenian entrepreneur. He worked in energy futures. He made a small fortune for himself and decided with about 2 months to go before Slovenia's last election to run for parliament. And you'll see how he did in that parliament. So Golob isn't available for Slovakia, but there are Golobs out there, I think, who could sort of fill that space. And I don't know what they are going to look like. They're probably going to be smiling. They may not have his long hair, but there are out there opportunities. And we've seen, and I'll show you in multiple different countries, the emergence at the very last minute, in some cases, of political parties that have done incredibly well. And if that were to happen, if there were a clean and competent newcomer on Slovakia's political party scene, and I'm not saying there will be, but the opportunity is there. If you've looked at Slovakia's polling lately, there is not a single political figure in Slovakia who has more trust than distrust. Every single one of them is underwater. And that says to me that for good or for bad, there is a lot of room for somebody to enter that space. Dzurinda thought, I think he was the one. His added 1% to Spolu suggests that he may not be the one. Heger has been talking about his own party. Whether he's too much of a known quantity, I think, is an open question. But I think that a newcomer like this could really radically transform Slovakia's political party systems. And it would actually not only add a newcomer, but I think it would threaten to shave a few points off of existing parties where people are moderately dissatisfied. And I think within virtually every party, within Olano, within Sulik Sas, within Kolár's party, there are voters who vote for them because they're the best option that they can think of. If someone new and clean were to come along, especially at the last minute, before all of the criticism and all of the laundry were aired, I think you could see something that looks fundamentally different. And when you sort of look at what's gone on in Slovakia in the past, I mean, we saw in 2010, both Bugar and Sulik started low and emerged quite high. But for them, it was a kind of long slog. They started low, like Dzurinda with his blue coalition is kind of doing right now. And they've sort of emerged into that space. But if we look at later elections in Slovakia, we see people like Procházka with his Siet appearing and suddenly jumping into first or second place in the public opinion polls. We saw the same thing with Boris Kolár being almost unknown shortly before the election and managing just to squeak over that 5% barrier. We saw Kotleba actually rising from 2%, a kind of low position, suddenly above the threshold in 2016. And in 2020, we saw leaders appear sort of from elsewhere. So we saw Progressive Slovakia and we saw Kiska's party emerge, peak, and then decline. But they peaked usually about 2 or 3 months after they emerged. Now, if you could imagine a party formed now or in 2 or 3 months, peaking at about election time, you can imagine what might happen in Slovakia's politics. If had they timed it differently, they might have had a different kind of position. As it was Matović who took advantage of that sort of last-minute bandwagon effect. But if you look at that line, look at the party polling at 8% 2 months before the election, and when it became clear that that was the strongest opponent, voters jumped onto that bandwagon very, very quickly. So all of the stuff that I've showed you about political polling actually is really heavily contingent on what could happen if people see that this person or that person is really the main candidate on a particular side. And not to use only Slovakia, this is Golub's path. Golub went from nothing to about 35% in about 2 months. And we've also seen this previously in Slovakia with Miro Cerar, and we've seen it in Bulgaria with the formulation of a party called The Change Continues. I think would be a good name for a party in Slovakia, or at least a good description of Slovakia's party politics, because that change does continue. I don't know if this is going to happen, but all I can say is that that opportunity is there for someone to do it. And so I wouldn't be surprised if someone jumps into this fray at the last minute. And if they do, it's going to throw everything really into a kind of disarray, because it makes a lot of currently viable parties potentially unviable, and it really alters the math. So in some ways, your question, and I'm sorry to go on such a long discussion of that, but it's in some ways too early to tell. Who would have thought that 6 months before the election is too early to tell? But the volatility and the constant shifts in voter behavior, not just in Slovakia, but in Slovenia and Bulgaria and even the Czech Republic, and even these days in France and Italy, I think is a kind of broader trend, and I think it's one that we need to pay attention to, because things can change very, very fast. Sorry, that was the world's longest answer.
So, Kevin, if you were to do an overall assessment, have things been getting better or worse? What are the biggest strengths and weaknesses of Slovakia's democracy?
I want to leave time for people to ask questions and to talk about this, because I don't want to sort of monopolize that. But I will say that I see both hopefulness and potential problems. I think this kind of instability in political party systems is potentially a problem, not because it leads to authoritarianism, but because it leads to sort of incoherent policymaking. And it makes it difficult to get things done. It makes it difficult to sustain one particular path over time. I think that's a problem, especially in an era where our problems are big and our problems are really long-lasting. To have such short-lived policymaking decisions, I think is a real problem. I also think that Slovakia, like most of the Western world, does face a problem from the kinds of extremism that are propagated through social media and other forms of media channels that are supported by countries that have a vested interest in seeing democracy fail. So I think we should really pay attention to that, and I think we should pay attention to the fact that often those kinds of discourses both undermine kind of stable foreign policy and target the weakest people in those societies. It is Roma, it is immigrants who are targeted by a lot of that discourse, and not just targeted in policy terms, but that kind of discourse leads to physical attacks. It leads to discrimination that keeps people from getting jobs and so on. I think these are some really significant problems, and especially the Roma issue, which Slovakia, not only Slovakia, the Czech Republic, the entire region have a real difficulty getting a handle on. I think are fundamental questions. We're going to see waves of immigrants in the future. I think those are things that we really, in addition to the long-term policymaking problem, need to pay attention to, and they are made much worse by these kinds of extremist views that are propagated through mechanisms that people have come to see as normal. On the other hand, and I think I mentioned this, so I won't go into it a lot more, I think Slovakia's fundamentals are sound. And I don't know if it's patronizing, but I've been so proud to go back to Slovakia and to meet the people who are working in Slovakia's civic sector, to work in Slovakia's journalism sector, the amount of investigative journalism, the amount of work that people are doing, I think is really remarkable. I had a chance to talk to Czech journalists and Czech civil society officials as well. It's sometimes difficult to get Czechs to say nice and enthusiastic things about Slovakia, but on questions of civil society and especially on journalism, they were in awe of what Slovakia's been able to accomplish. And they look at their sort of relatively monopolized oligarchic media, and they look at Slovakia's worker-owned, journalist-owned newspapers and Slovakia's Center for Independent Journalism, I think, and see a really, really positive role model, not just for themselves, but for the region. So I think that those underlying questions of civil society and journalism and the kinds of things that keep democracy alive, I think are really, really strong. And as long as those can filter up, as long as those can keep Slovaks sort of paying attention, Slovak leaders paying attention to what voters want, I think things will go better than not. I hope that there will be some ability to resolve this kind of constant churn of political parties. But having just written a book on political parties, our solution section was about 3 paragraphs long. It's very hard to convince a country to develop long-standing political party institutions if the political parties themselves can't manage to make that work. So I hope so. Some of the work that we're doing is helping to encourage parties to build connections with demographic groups, with the young, and to sort of build those long-term relationships. If they can do that, I think the prospects in terms of Slovakia's overall democracy are pretty bright. And I would say, actually, and this is maybe just one last thing to say, I have been really impressed by the fact that Slovaks take democracy very, very seriously. The people we talk to on all sides of the political spectrum, with a few exceptions and a few very loud voices, are people who are really conscious that democracy is important, and they are conscious that democracy is constant, needs a constant effort. I think that's actually something that Americans sort of lost the sense of. Things seem to be working. We sort of forgot about it, and I don't think we made the investment into how our democracy works. And I think in the last 5-10 years, Americans have started to see that too. And in this way, I think Slovaks are ahead of the game. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Slovakia taking notes about what to bring back to my own country to help encourage democracy in my own state, in my own region. And so in that sense, I think Americans have really a lot to learn if they pay close attention to what's going on, because Slovaks know how important this is. They know what it means to lose it, and they know what it means to work to keep it alive.
We have time for questions.
Great.
Okay, I have 2 questions from our online audience. Okay, Theodore Russell is asking, how important is the EW access now, and how much has the Ukraine war influenced it?
Got it. So, Ambassador Russell, so the EW influence, is it? Oh,
East-West.
okay. So thinking about domestic politics in Slovakia, I think we've seen a stronger role for foreign policy in domestic politics than we've seen in a while. I think in the initial period, when we talk about the first, second, and third decades, I think in the first decade, that question of EU accession and what was going on in the West played an incredibly strong role in Slovakia's politics. I think in that second decade, questions about foreign investment, not necessarily foreign policy, played a role. In the last 3 years, for obvious reasons, I think that kind of East-West question has reemerged as a dynamic, and it's reemerged as an issue of debate. It had always been there, sort of lurking, but it hadn't been, I think, as prominent an issue. When a major war breaks out with a country on your borders, I think it really does transform the nature of politics in that country. It's interesting that it hasn't necessarily reshaped Slovakia's politics. It simply sort of sharpened some of the differences and sharpened some of the positions. In a way, I think it's actually sort of forced that split within the left, which could prove pivotal. The parties on the other part of Slovakia's political spectrum have remained relatively solid on questions related to the war. It's really the sort of the former SMAD or the current SMAD and Hlas where you see that kind of divide emerging. And I think it's going to pull voters in one direction or the other, depending on where. There doesn't seem to be anything like a majority of Slovaks in favor of a closer relationship or tie with Russia. And so in a way, it may be a good, solid effort by SMAD at sort of party building, but I don't know that it's a solid effort at sort of developing something that's going to look like a majority coalition. It could sort of solidify their voting base, but keep them in a box that keeps them out of power. Ambassador Russell, if I didn't answer your question, re-ask it. So I don't know if I've gotten there.
Okay, our next question is from Ed Snyder. What has been the impact of President Chaputova's administration on current and possibly future parliamentary politics, civil society?
Hi, Ed. Ed was actually a Fulbrighter when I was a Fulbrighter, just before I was a Fulbrighter, so it's great. This is like old home week. And that's a great question. And I feel remiss in not having mentioned President Chaputova, who has done, I think, a great job. Now, the Slovak presidency's powers are really quite quite limited. And really, we end up with someone who, at least in American terms, has a kind of bully pulpit, an ability to sort of speak to issues of the day, but can't really shape sort of politics. It's interesting to see that the last president of Slovakia, after leaving the presidency, immediately turned to party politics because Parliament was the place where those the real power is held. But I think President Chaputova has done as good a job as really anyone could do to sort of ride the wave of this chaos, to provide a certain kind of stability, even as the government was disagreeing with itself, was fighting with itself. And you really had, whenever you get three alpha males in a room, each of whom believes that they should be the one with political power, it helps to have an alpha female in the room to say, stop it, and to bring some sense to the situation. So I've really been impressed. Obviously, it's very difficult in any country to sort of, have the responsibility in a way without the power to actually make those kinds of changes. And so I think it's natural that we would see, the president's approval rating just, sort of sliding and dipping. But, for me, the influence has been positive. The voice has been positive. And it's been one of moderation. It's going to be very interesting to see, how the president manages what could be incredibly complex coalition negotiations after this next election. If we have, 8 or 9 different parties in parliament from all of those, 3 different axes in different ways, there are all sorts of different kinds of combinations that could emerge. But I think Slovakia is lucky to have that kind of overarching figure, the head of state, someone who seems capable of handling those kinds of issues.
I have one more question here from Anonymous. What has been your impression of what Chaputova has done in her role? It feels like Slovakia is not as strong in the EU as they used to be.
That's a good question. I wouldn't necessarily blame that on Chaputova. I think it really is a question, and the ambassador would actually have a much better sense of this. And I don't follow sort of Slovak EU politics as closely as I could. I wish I actually had my colleague Tim here to talk about this. Maybe if he's watching, he'll email in an answer. But I think whenever you have a coalition that is this fractious, I think it's hard for a country to really kind of have a strong influence. And, Slovakia, as one of the smaller members of the European Union, always has difficulty being heard. Sometimes it can actually manage. I mean, and the Slovak diplomatic service has been magnificent. And, we have this phrase, punching above your weight. I think in many cases, Slovakia has actually managed to have an outsized influence on what is, a 390 million person kind of, semi-state in Europe. So for Slovakia to have a role in that, I think is really quite significant. But I wouldn't attribute the lack of Slovakia's ability to do that to the president.
That's all the questions from our online audience.
Hope so.
Are there any questions?
Voter turnout, has it tended to be stable? Does it hover? Does it spike? Does it fall?
So voter turnout has moved around quite a bit. In general terms, it really depends on which election. So Slovakia is renowned in Europe as having consistently the lowest turnout in European elections, quite consistently over time. There was a period from the mid 1990s until about the early 2010s when you saw it kind of declining turnout in Slovakia. But in many of the areas, and they tend to track one another, the declines have stopped, and in some cases we see a return. That's not always a good thing. And we actually have seen this in the United States. Sometimes turnout increases precisely because the stakes are so high. And you never want to be in an election where the stakes are so high that people feel like they absolutely must turn out to vote. That's sometimes a bad sign. But Slovakia's turnout rates have been moderate, have not been continuing to decline, and depending on which race you're looking at, have actually sort of turned around in many cases. So I think we don't look at, with the exception of the EU elections, where Slovakia is just the lowest among many low countries. especially from Eastern Europe. Slovakia hasn't been a huge question of concern. What is really interesting to me is the way that turnout shifts over time. And a lot of what happened in the 2020 election, if the polls that we read are to be believed, is that people came out of the sort of previous periods of non-voting. They came back into the electorate in order to vote for what they saw as Matowic's attempt to sort of eliminate corruption and so on. And so we get a lot of shifts back and forth about who's coming back into the electorate. So the relative turnout may stay the same, but who's coming back actually then dictates what's going to go on in those elections. And when we see those sharp spikes on the graphs, that's often people who had previously said they weren't going to go and vote, suddenly getting excited, or at least thinking there was a chance for something to be different if they voted for X, Y, and Z. So it's really those previously undeclared or non-voters, I think, where a lot of that volatility happens, and those are the ones to watch.
There is another question. Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name's John Mattis, actually Mattis, if you wanted to pronounce it right. I have a question for you. Very good analysis on what's happening, in the political parties and how people view each other. But a question I came up with as you were talking is, are there others in Europe, similar researchers like yourself, who are looking at Slovakia issues, the politics? Who are these people? What do they see? What do they say? And is there any consensus among these scholars like yourself who are looking at Slovakia, and how do they view the situation?
That's great. That's a great question. And the first thing I want to say, there are groups of scholars, and in fact, the Slovak Studies Association is an international group of scholars that do this. I've had good luck to be involved in that. And Sharon Wolczyk, who's watching from home, I know, has headed that organization in the past. Carol Leff and many others. So there are a group of scholars. Political science is changing a little bit, and so you don't see quite as many country-level scholars as you used to. People like me are sort of reaching the end of our lifespans, and the newer scholars tend to study a lot more countries. They tend to do a little bit of that less sort of deep dive and language learning and so on. So unfortunately, there aren't quite as many younger scholars, but there still are a significant number of international scholars. The amazing thing is we're not that necessary anymore because there is such a strong body of younger Slovak scholars. Now, I wouldn't want to speak for them in terms of consensus, but what I have seen in the scholarship that I have read has been a lot of focus on the radical right. So there is a strong body of scholars who really are very worried about, pay a lot of concern to that radical right, but not just in Slovakia, in other places. So across Slovakia's borders, to the west, you have Okamura's Social Party of Democracy. To the north, obviously, you have not only Kaczynski's parties, but some other radical right parties in Hungary, in Slovenia, a party that sort of verges on that as well. So there is a lot of concern about where these parties are going, but not just there. And one of the really interesting things for me has been the degree to which studies of Slovak politics have become integrated with studies of not just the Visegrad Four, not just the former Soviet bloc, but really parties across the board. And the really big growth over the last 10 to 15 years has been in scholarship that compares, say, Slovakia to Italy. And that kind of chaos that you see with political parties moving back and forth is almost indistinguishable from Italy. It's starting to be indistinguishable from France. One of my colleagues who is at Sciences Po in France, Jan Rovny, has recently published an article and is working on a project about what Western scholars have to learn from those in Eastern Europe. And then, in fact, there are French scholars who are looking at the Czech Republic, at Slovakia, to understand much more fluid political environments and so on. It doesn't mean it's good news necessarily, but there is a lot of research by people like me about, especially in political party terms, both the radical right and this kind of constant churn. What I think some people call populism, you haven't heard me use that term yet because that term can mean so many things to so many different people. Fico's a populist, or Kotleba's a populist, or Dzurinda's a populist. I mean, everyone gets called populism. And in fact, before the 2008 election, I did a survey. Every single party in Slovakia had called every single other party a populist at least one point during the previous year. But that kind kind of political engagement where you appeal directly to the people and you call all of the other parties kind of corrupt scum. You promise to drain the swamp. That kind of politics, the kind of politics that's built around celebrity and really short-term social media-driven relationships, it's present in Slovakia. It's present across the region. And I think a lot of people who study Slovakia's politics and the region's the politics of other countries in the region and Europe in general are really sort of starting to look at those and say, this is where the action is, in the sense this is where the big changes that are going to affect the future are going to lie. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
Hi, I'm Kevin Hall, the North America editor for OCCRP. I enjoyed the talk.
Nice to see you.
I'll ask a self-serving question about, we're on the 5th anniversary of our colleague Jan Kuciak's death. Yeah. How would you assess, you had mentioned the state control of media under Orban, and how much of an influence in Slovakia has that had in terms of media control, and how would you assess the 5 years since Jan's death in terms of media openness, transparency, and most of my career has been in Latin America, where it's much more common to have journalists killed. It's very rare in Slovakia.
Absolutely. I mean, and not just, it's not just a Slovakia question. It's Malta. It's obviously Russia. It's other, countries both in the East and in the West where this kind of thing happens. I think that event, I think most of us probably remember hearing about that event. It's one of those sort of points that you think, oh, things have, this is different, right? This is changed. I think it was, and again, I'd be really curious to know what others think. It seemed to serve as a crystallizing event, that those strains and threads were there, but that it somehow provided a basis for those to be woven together. I think it had a really important effect on what happened in the subsequent election in terms of catalyzing people who were tired of what was going on. I think it took that corruption issue and gave it two human faces, and it really took that sort of question of abuse of political power and made it very utterly clear. I think it also has provided at least a catalyzing point for Slovakia's media, and I was really quite impressed. Having spent several weeks with Czech journalists and several weeks sort of periodically interviewing Slovak journalists at the robustness of Slovak media, the commitment to what is a difficult, dangerous sometimes job. I think is really important. And when you talk to those journalists, and something you do, I'm sure, all the time, at least what I've heard is that the moment of those murders provided an opportunity for a new kind of journalism, a new kind of emphasis. It provided a kind of nucleus, a catalyzing point for the building of structures, for funding, and so on. It also, I think, at least those journalists said, at least periodically, even among parties that were not friendly towards journalists, opened the space up a little bit. It reduced the sense of threat and so on. What they were certainly worried about last summer, and I suspect this is true, is that after a while the effects of those catalyzing incidents wear off a little bit, and you return to a kind of status quo like it was before, when the dangers return. And so in that sense, I think there is always the possibility that those lessons can be forgotten. There is the possibility that the energy that goes into building these institutions can erode over time, and you end up sort of back where you were. And let's hope that it doesn't take another just tragic catalyzing event to sort of move things back in that direction. At least for the moment, what I saw was a lot of people trying to institutionalize, to really firm up a tradition that they felt had been neglected, and sort of when the light was cast back on it, they took full advantage of that light to build new structures in those places. Does that correspond to your experience?
Questions from the audience?
Hi, I'm David Frankel, Friends of Slovakia. One of the things I think I've heard you say in past presentations, which you didn't dwell on today, was the fact that some parties are led by leaders, and their popularity is what drives the electorate. Yeah. So as you have someone like Mečiar, Zurinda, it doesn't really matter who, Matrovic, their popularity shoots up,
Yep.
it plateaus. As they go down, their party at some point disintegrates. And I see, except with the exception in the United States of Donald Trump, I think most Americans would agree that if you point to a Democrat, you kind of know where they stand on certain issues, and a Republican, certain issues. It's not the leader so much, except Donald Trump, that determines what the electorate thinks of what the party will do. So I guess my question, and I think I've heard you say this before, so I'm not going to ask you to just repeat that, but rather, what can be done in Slovakia
That's a good.
to get away from the personality of the cult personality of the leaders, left, right, center, it doesn't matter, but rather to develop policies as the old Democrat, the old Republican Party in the United States, so there'll be a more stable. You won't see graphs that look so much like this, and I'll stop now.
Although what I will say is you won't see that graph for the two parties. Actually, if you do that graph for the United States, which I've done, it's 2 bars that go along, right? It's just straight across. It's just red and blue, and that's it. But, and Tim and I have thought this, it's, America has a 2-party system, but it actually in some ways looks more like 2-party systems. So within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party, so within the Republican Party, you see every single one. You see shifting, moving, turning. You see those individual, reality TV star entrepreneurs who promise to drain the swamp. Those are in that party. You see similar kinds of figures within the Democratic Party. So the figures aren't absent. It's just the kind of container that encloses them that is similar. So we're seeing the same things here. And the question that's turned around is, how do you stop one of those kinds of characters? We're actually working on a big, long project about the history of these kinds of new parties that sort of pop up, work around particular individuals without a real kind of ideological basis. And these are very hard to stop in a way. It's very hard to build structures around those, particularly in a world, and this isn't just a Slovakia problem, in a world that is built these days around social media as mechanisms of communication, that is built around celebrity as a mechanism of gaining attention. We've done quite a bit of work actually on the meaning, the underlying idea of celebrity. These days, many people become politicians. The pathway to becoming a politician is no longer to serve your time by moving up. The pathway is to get famous somewhere else, whether it's on The Apprentice or whether it's writing a book or on Oprah or whatever it is. The pathway is to become famous and then to go into politics. And across the region, we're seeing people who are journalists, talk show hosts, musicians, sports stars, internet entrepreneurs. These are the kinds of people who get famous and then go into politics. It's very hard to know how to stop that. You can provide sort of party funding so that you'll fund parties once they get into office, but that just raises the stakes for those people who are famous to gather the money ahead of time so that they can get in and sort of tap those veins of money. It's been really difficult. And things like this, the parties that have the people with the biggest vested interest in stopping this are the ones who are already in there. They're the ones who run parliament, and if they can't stop it, it's hard to imagine a kind of policy path that would. So what we've been trying to do is to sort of work with parties that are sort of on the edge of teetering in one direction or another. And I think, sort of Pellegrini's party is an example. It is a party that could move toward a more classic model with membership and organization and replacing leaders, or it could not. So as we talk to people from political parties, as we move from taking off our scholar's hat and putting on sometimes our kind of, what could you be doing hat, it really is to do that. It's in the long-term vested interest of the party to do it. If you don't do it, you go like this, and then you go like that. If you don't have a solid membership, if you can't change your leader, your party's going to die. The problem is a lot of these leaders don't care. They get in, they get what they're there for, and then they don't mind if they're kicked out. And unless you can change that incentive structure, like I said, our last book, it was really thin on what to do now because because the people with their own vested interest in keeping those parties out haven't been successful in doing it. But Slovakia clearly has a problem with leader-driven parties. I mean, on this list, almost every party on this list, almost every party in Slovakia's parliament is run by the person who founded it. Almost none of these parties have ever seen a leadership change. Progressive Slovakia has seen one, KDH has seen one, and that's about it. Unless you get out of that cycle, I don't know what you do. So I have a null answer on that question, but that really is, I mean, and maybe it's a good place because that is the question. It's just not one for which there's a good answer. Are there other questions? Thank you all. I really appreciate having the chance to talk to you. I look forward to talking to you after this. I know there's some food and drink over there. For those of you online, thank you for watching, for sitting through all of this. And we'll try to make my email available through Friends of Slovakia or the others so that if you want to send me an email and ask further follow-up questions in addition to the ones that were asked, I would love to engage in this conversation. You can probably tell I get really excited about this. So if you've got questions, I look forward to talking to all of you online. And thank you for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this.